In the bustling streets of Miami, Lieutenant Colonel Ethan Carter has spent over 2 decades upholding justice. But when a call from the governor forces him to relocate to the small, secretive town of Oak Ridge, Alabama, his life and the lives of his family are thrown into turmoil. From the moment they arrive, the Carters are met with cold stares, subtle hostility, and blatant racism. Ethan's colleagues at the Oak Ridge police station view him with suspicion, and his family struggles to find acceptance in a community resistant to change. But when Ethan is unjustly detained during a late-night jog by local officers who refuse to believe he's one of their own, the humiliation ignites a fire within him. Determined to uncover the truth behind the town's animosity, Ethan delves deep into a web of corruption and racial injustice that threatens not just his career, but the safety of his entire family. As secrets come to light, Ethan realizes he's walking the same dangerous path as his predecessor, a path that could lead to his downfall. In a town where silence is enforced and power is protected, Ethan must choose between standing down or fighting back. But with every step forward, the stakes grow higher and the danger more imminent. Can Ethan protect his family and expose the truth before it's too late? Or will Oak Ridge claim another victim in its relentless grip of corruption? The Reluctant Guardian is a heart-pounding, emotional thriller that explores the lengths one man will go to fight for justice, even when the odds are stacked against him. Physical description: Ethan is a 45-year-old African-American man with a commanding presence. He stands at 6 feet 2 inches with a muscular build, honed by years of police work. His closely cropped black hair is speckled with gray, and his brown eyes convey both warmth and authority. A small scar above his right eyebrow hints at past dangers in the line of duty. Backstory: Ethan has dedicated over 2 decades to the Miami Police Department, rising through the ranks due to his unyielding commitment to justice. Born and raised in a tough Miami neighborhood, he has always been driven to protect those who can't protect themselves. Ethan is deeply principled, with a strong sense of duty, but his transfer to Oak Ridge challenges everything he believes in. Physical description: Melissa is a 42-year-old African-American woman with a nurturing aura. She has a medium build and stands at 5 feet 7 inches. Her long, dark hair is usually tied back in a neat ponytail, and her brown eyes are gentle yet perceptive. Melissa's face carries the subtle lines of someone who has spent years caring for others. Backstory: Melissa is a dedicated nurse who has worked in some of Miami's busiest hospitals. Her compassionate nature and strong moral compass make her the emotional backbone of the Carter family. Born in Atlanta, she met Ethan in college and moved to Miami after they married. She's the calm in the storm, always prioritizing her family's well-being while navigating the challenges of small-town life in Oak Ridge. Physical description: Ryan is a 17-year-old African-American teenager who stands at 6 feet 0 inches with a lean, athletic build. He has short, curly black hair and expressive brown eyes. His facial features are sharp, and he often wears a focused, determined expression. Backstory: Ryan is a star basketball player at his Miami high school and is known for his discipline and determination on and off the court. He dreams of playing college basketball and has been working tirelessly to achieve that goal. The move to Oak Ridge forces him to adjust to a new school and a different social environment, where he faces prejudice but remains resilient. Physical description: Chloe is a 15-year-old African-American girl with a petite frame. She stands at 5 feet 4 inches and has shoulder-length, wavy black hair. Her eyes are a deep brown, and she often wears a thoughtful, serious expression. She's usually seen with a book in hand, reflecting her love for reading. Backstory: Chloe is an introspective and academically gifted teenager. She excels in her studies and is passionate about social justice, influenced by her parents' values. Moving to Oak Ridge is particularly challenging for her, as she struggles to find her place in a school where she feels like an outsider. Despite the challenges, Chloe is determined to stand up for what's right, inspired by her father's fight for justice. Description: Oak Ridge is a small, insular town in Alabama with a population of just over 5,000. It's a place where time seems to have stood still, characterized by its narrow streets, small houses, and a few local businesses. The town has a tense undercurrent, with a clear division between the white and black communities. Oak Ridge is deeply rooted in tradition, resistant to change, and wary of outsiders. Description: the police station in Oak Ridge is a small, aging building with red brick walls and a faded sign. Inside, it's cramped and dimly lit, with outdated furniture and an air of neglect. The atmosphere is tense, with an undercurrent of suspicion and hostility. The officers there are predominantly white, and the station is a microcosm of the town's deep-seated prejudices. Description: the Carters' new home in Oak Ridge is a modest, two-story house on the outskirts of town. It's spacious enough for the family, but lacks the warmth and familiarity of their Miami home. The house is simple, with basic furnishings provided by the precinct. The neighborhood is quiet, and the Carters often notice the curious or unfriendly gazes of their neighbors from behind closed curtains. Description: Oak Ridge High is the only high school in town, with a student body that reflects the town's demographics. The building is old, with a worn exterior and a somewhat neglected interior. The school has a traditional, conservative atmosphere, and newcomers like Ryan and Chloe are quickly singled out. The social hierarchy is rigid, with long-standing cliques and a subtle, yet pervasive sense of exclusion for those who don't fit in. Description: the local hospital where Melissa works is a small, understaffed facility that serves the entire town and surrounding areas. The hospital staff is predominantly white, and while the medical care is adequate, there is a noticeable lack of warmth and camaraderie. Melissa's arrival is met with polite but distant professionalism, and she quickly senses the unspoken barriers that exist within the hospital's culture. Cause: Ethan Carter is in his Miami office, reviewing reports, when he receives a call from his police chief. Effect: the chief informs Ethan of his unexpected transfer to Oak Ridge, Alabama, due to a direct request from the governor, leaving Ethan stunned and apprehensive. Cause: Ethan meets with the police chief, who emphasizes the necessity of the transfer. Effect: Ethan feels torn between duty and family, but ultimately accepts the transfer, realizing he has no choice but to prepare for a difficult conversation with his family. Cause: Ethan returns home and tells his wife, Melissa, and their children, Ryan and Chloe, about the move. Effect: the family reacts with shock and concern, each dealing with the news in their own way. Despite the anxiety, they resolve to support each other. Cause: the Carters begin packing and saying their goodbyes to friends in Miami. Effect: as the reality of the move sets in, the family feels the emotional weight of leaving behind their life in Miami, but they try to remain hopeful about the new chapter ahead. Cause: the family arrives in Oak Ridge after a long drive and immediately notices the stark difference from Miami. Effect: they are met with unfriendly stares from some neighbors, foreshadowing the challenges they will face in their new town. Ethan tries to remain positive, but the unease is palpable. Cause: Ethan reports to the Oak Ridge police station to begin his new role. Effect: he is met with cold, suspicious stares from his new colleagues, particularly from Sergeant Peters, setting the tone for the hostility he will face. Cause: Melissa starts her job at the local hospital, hoping to make a positive impression. Effect: she encounters a chilly reception from her colleagues, who seem distant and unwelcoming, making her feel isolated and uneasy. Cause: Ryan and Chloe attend their first day at Oak Ridge High School, where they try to fit in. Effect: both siblings face subtle but noticeable prejudice from their classmates, making it clear they are outsiders in this tight-knit community. Cause: Ethan overhears Sergeant Peters making a racially insensitive joke in the station. Effect: Ethan confronts Peters, but his authority is challenged, and the tension between them escalates, signaling that Ethan's leadership will be contested. Cause: the family gathers for dinner, sharing their first experiences in Oak Ridge. Effect: the Carters discuss the hostility they each encountered, deepening their resolve to support one another, but also amplifying their fears about the challenges ahead. Cause: Ethan leads a morning meeting at the station, trying to assert his leadership. Effect: Sergeant Peters and other officers subtly undermine his authority, making Ethan realize that earning their respect will be a long, uphill battle. Cause: Melissa tries to connect with her colleagues during a lunch break at the hospital. Effect: her attempts are met with lukewarm responses, and she starts to feel increasingly isolated, questioning whether she and her family will ever be accepted in Oak Ridge. Cause: Ryan joins the school's basketball team, hoping to find a sense of belonging. Effect: he faces hostility from his teammates, particularly Brian, who resents Ryan's skills and presence, making it clear that acceptance will not come easily. Cause: Chloe encounters direct prejudice from classmates during a class discussion. Effect: she feels ostracized and begins to question whether she can thrive academically in such a hostile environment, increasing her anxiety. Cause: Ethan goes for a late-night jog to clear his mind after a stressful week. Effect: he is unjustly detained by local police officers who don't recognize him and treat him with suspicion, leading to a humiliating and tense encounter that shakes him deeply. Cause: Ethan returns home after the late-night incident, shaken and frustrated. Effect: he shares the experience with Melissa and the children, who are horrified and angry, strengthening their resolve to fight against the prejudice they face in Oak Ridge. Cause: Ethan decides to file a formal complaint against the officers involved in the incident. Effect: Captain Harris promises an investigation, but Ethan senses reluctance, realizing that the road to justice will be fraught with resistance. Cause: word of the incident spreads at school, leading to increased hostility toward Ryan and Chloe. Effect: Ryan confronts Brian about his attitude, while Chloe feels even more isolated, pushing the siblings to rely on each other for support. Cause: Ethan notices Peter's behaving more cautiously, but still senses underlying resentment. Effect: Peters approaches Ethan, hinting at a change of heart, but Ethan remains wary, unsure if Peters is sincere or simply trying to avoid scrutiny. Cause: the Carters gather for dinner, discussing the ongoing challenges and the investigation. Effect: they reaffirm their commitment to stand together, despite the growing tensions, and Ethan resolves to see the fight for justice through, no matter the cost. Cause: the internal investigation into the officers involved in Ethan's incident begins. Effect: Ethan senses increasing tension at the station, with colleagues growing more hostile as the investigation threatens to expose deeper issues within the department. Cause: Melissa becomes increasingly worried about Ethan's safety and the well-being of their children. Effect: she discusses her fears with Ethan, who reassures her but also acknowledges the dangers they face, leading Melissa to consider contacting the media if necessary. Cause: Ethan uncovers evidence suggesting that his predecessor was investigating similar issues before being forced out. Effect: realizing he is being set up to take the fall, Ethan begins gathering more evidence, knowing that the corruption runs deeper than he initially thought. Cause: Ryan and Chloe decide to confront the prejudice at school head-on, tired of being victims. Effect: Ryan speaks out during a school assembly, while Chloe stands up to her classmates in a class discussion, both actions earning them respect from some and further animosity from others. Cause: Ethan shares his discoveries with Melissa, and they discuss the risks of continuing the fight. Effect: the family decides to go public with the evidence if the investigation is buried, agreeing that they must fight for what's right, no matter the consequences. Cause: the investigation leads to a trial, with the officers involved in the incident facing charges of misconduct. Effect: the courtroom is tense, with the community divided, and Ethan's family standing by him as they testify about the impact of the incident on their lives. Cause: after days of testimony and deliberation, the judge delivers a verdict. Effect: the officers are found guilty, and the decision sends shockwaves through Oak Ridge, with some celebrating the victory for justice and others resentful of the change. Cause: following the trial, Ethan and his family are surrounded by supporters and media, eager to hear their thoughts. Effect: Ethan emphasizes that while this is a victory, the fight against injustice is far from over, and he vows to continue working towards a more just community. Cause: the story gains national attention, and the Carters are thrust into the spotlight. Effect: The increased attention brings both support and new challenges, as Ethan must navigate the complexities of being a public figure in the fight for justice. Cause. With the trial behind them, the Carters sit down for a quiet family dinner, reflecting on their journey. Effect. They discuss the road ahead, knowing that while the battle in Oak Ridge is far from over, they are stronger and more united than ever, ready to face whatever challenges come their way. This structure ensures that each chapter builds toward the next, with each scene driving the story forward through cause and effect relationships, ultimately leading to the climax and resolution in Chapter 6. Ethan Carter sat at his desk in the Miami Police Department, the familiar buzz of the station filtering through his office door. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the reports spread out before him. His coffee sat untouched, forgotten as he focused on the details of a recent case. It was a typical Monday morning until the phone rang. The sudden shrill broke his concentration, and Ethan frowned as he reached for the receiver. "Lieutenant Colonel Carter," he answered, his voice steady as always. "Ethan, it's Chief Reynolds. I need you in my office. Now." There was something in the chief's tone that made Ethan sit up straighter. "Yes, sir. I'll be right there." He hung up, a knot of unease forming in his stomach. Chief Reynolds wasn't the kind of man to summon someone without good reason. As Ethan made his way through the bustling precinct, he exchanged brief nods with the officers he passed. He'd spent over 20 years here, rising through the ranks on the strength of his dedication and integrity. This was home, but something told him that whatever awaited him in the chief's office could change everything. He knocked once before entering. Chief Reynolds looked up from behind his cluttered desk, his expression unusually grim. "Ethan, take a seat." Ethan did as he was told, his mind racing with possibilities. "What's this about, Chief?" The chief leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach. "Ethan, you've been with us a long time. You're one of my best officers, and I trust you. That's why I have to tell you this personally." He paused, as if weighing his words. "You've been transferred." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. "Transferred? But why? Where?" "To Oak Ridge, Alabama," the chief replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "The governor made the request personally. They need someone with your experience to handle a situation there. It's sensitive." Ethan's mind raced. Oak Ridge? A small town in Alabama, miles away from everything he and his family knew. "Chief, my family is settled here. My wife, Melissa, she's got a good job at the hospital, and our kids, Ryan and Chloe, they're doing great in school. This move, it's going to turn our lives upside down." "I know," Reynolds said, his voice softer now. "But the request is non-negotiable. You're the man for the job, Ethan. I wouldn't be telling you this if I didn't think you could handle it." Ethan sat back, trying to process the information. His thoughts immediately went to his family. How would they take this? The decision was out of his hands, but it would change everything for them. "When do I leave?" "You've got a month to get your affairs in order," Reynolds replied. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I know this isn't easy." Ethan nodded, standing up. "I understand, Chief. I'll do what I have to." As he left the office, the weight of the news settled heavily on his shoulders. He had to break this to his family, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. Ethan drove home in silence, his mind replaying the conversation with Chief Reynolds over and over. The sun was setting by the time he pulled into the driveway of their comfortable suburban home. The house was quiet, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside him. He found Melissa in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. The aroma of her cooking filled the air, a comforting scent that usually eased his worries. But tonight, not even that could help. "Hey, honey," she greeted him with a warm smile. "How was your day?" Ethan forced a smile in return, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We need to talk, Melissa." Her hands stilled, and she turned to face him, concern etching her features. "What's wrong, Ethan?" He took a deep breath, knowing there was no easy way to say it. "I've been transferred. We have to move to Oak Ridge, Alabama." Melissa's eyes widened in shock. "Transferred? But why? What about your work here? What about the kids?" "The request came from the governor," Ethan explained, his voice heavy. "It's a sensitive assignment, and they need someone with my experience." "I didn't have a choice, Melissa." She leaned against the counter, processing the news. "Alabama. That's so far. The kids, their friends, school, this is going to be hard on them, Ethan. I know, he said softly, reaching out to take her hand. I'm worried about that too. But we'll make it work. We always do. Melissa squeezed his hand, her eyes searching his. We built a life here. This move, it's going to be tough. But if this is what you have to do, then we'll make it work. We'll face it together. Ethan felt a surge of gratitude for his wife's strength. He knew this would be a challenge, but with Melissa by his side, he believed they could get through it. Thank you, he whispered, pulling her into a hug. I don't know what I'd do without you. As they embraced, the sound of laughter drifted in from the living room. Ryan and Chloe were watching TV, oblivious to the conversation that had just taken place. Ethan sighed, knowing he had to tell them next. Let's talk to the kids, he said, releasing Melissa and heading toward the living room. Melissa followed, her expression still troubled. Ryan, 17, and Chloe, 15, were sprawled on the couch, completely engrossed in their show. Ethan cleared his throat, and they both looked up, surprised to see their parents standing there with such serious expressions. Hey, Dad, Ryan said, raising an eyebrow. What's up? We need to have a family meeting, Ethan began, choosing his words carefully. There's something important we need to discuss. Chloe's face immediately filled with concern. What's going on? Is everything okay? Ethan exchanged a glance with Melissa before speaking. I've been transferred to a new assignment. We're moving to Oak Ridge, Alabama. For a moment, there was silence as the words sank in. Then Ryan spoke up, disbelief in his voice. Move? To Alabama? But what about school? What about our friends? I know this is sudden, and it's going to be a big change, Ethan said, trying to keep his voice calm. But this is something I have to do. We'll all be in this together, and we'll make it work. Chloe's eyes filled with tears. But, Dad, we got our lives here. Everything we know is here. Ethan's heart ached at the sight of his daughter's distress. I know, sweetheart, this won't be easy, but we'll find a way to adjust. We're a strong family, and we'll get through this together. Ryan crossed his arms, frustration clear on his face. This sucks. Melissa stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. I know, Ryan, it's a lot to take in, but we'll face this as a family. We've always been there for each other, and that won't change. Reluctantly, Ryan nodded, and Chloe wiped away her tears, trying to be brave. Okay, Mom, we'll try. Ethan smiled at his kids, grateful for their resilience. That's all I can ask. We'll get through this. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The Carters began the arduous process of packing up their lives in Miami. Each room in the house slowly emptied of its contents, the once cozy home now filled with boxes and the echo of memories. Melissa took charge of organizing the move, her efficient nature shining through as she labeled each box and scheduled movers. Ryan and Chloe, though still upset about the situation, helped as best they could, packing their belongings and saying their goodbyes to friends. Ethan, meanwhile, handled the logistics of transferring his position. He met with colleagues, ensuring a smooth handover of his responsibilities in Miami, all the while mentally preparing himself for what awaited him in Oak Ridge. One evening, as they sat surrounded by boxes, Melissa looked around at the bare walls and sighed. It's strange seeing the house like this. It doesn't feel like home anymore. Ethan nodded, understanding her sentiment. It's the people that make a home, not the place. We'll make our new house feel like home, too. Chloe, who was folding some clothes into a suitcase, looked up. Do you think Oak Ridge will ever feel like home, Dad? Ethan considered her question carefully. It might take some time, Chloe, but as long as we're together, we'll find our way. Ryan, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. I'm going to miss this place. Miami, it's who we are. Ethan placed a hand on his son's shoulder. I'm going to miss it too, but this is a new chapter for us. We'll take the good memories with us, and we'll make new ones in Oak Ridge. Melissa smiled softly at her husband's words, appreciating his attempt to keep their spirits up. Ethan's right. This move doesn't change who we are. We're still the Carters, and we're still a strong family. The children nodded, their resolve strengthening as the reality of the move settled in. They spent the rest of the evening reminiscing about their favorite memories in Miami, laughing and bonding over shared experiences. It was a bittersweet moment, filled with both sadness and hope. The day of the move arrived, and the Carters set off on the long drive to Oak Ridge. The atmosphere in the car was heavy, each family member lost in their thoughts as the miles rolled by. The vibrant cityscape of Miami slowly gave way to the rural expanse of the South, the landscape shifting from urban sprawl to open fields and quiet, winding roads. As they crossed into Alabama, the reality of their new life began to sink in. The contrast between their old home and this new place was stark, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead weighed heavily on them. When they finally arrived in Oak Ridge, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the town. Oak Ridge was small, much smaller than they had imagined. The streets were narrow, lined with modest houses and a few local businesses. It was quiet, almost eerily so, as if the town was holding its breath. Ethan turned down a side street, following the directions to their new home. The house was a two-story, brick structure on the outskirts of town. It was spacious enough for the family, but it lacked the warmth and familiarity of their Miami home. As they pulled into the driveway, they noticed a few neighbors watching from their porches, their expressions unreadable. "Well," Ethan said, trying to sound upbeat. "Welcome to Oak Ridge." Chloe peered out the window, her brow furrowed. "It's different." Ryan nodded in agreement, his arms crossed. "It's definitely not Miami." Melissa, ever the optimist, tried to put a positive spin on it. "Let's give it a chance. Who knows? It might be a good change." But even as she spoke, the unease in her voice was clear. The Carters stepped out of the car, stretching their legs after the long drive. As they began unloading their bags, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, judged by the curious, or perhaps suspicious, eyes of the townspeople. The air was thick with tension as they entered their new home. It was just as they had seen in the photos, clean, well-kept, but lacking the personal touches that made a house feel like a home. The walls were bare, the rooms echoing with emptiness. Melissa took a deep breath, trying to muster some enthusiasm. "We'll get settled in soon. Let's unpack a few things tonight and get some rest." The family agreed, though the weight of the day was heavy on their shoulders. They worked quietly, the silence only broken by the sound of boxes being opened and the occasional comment. As the evening wore on, Ethan found himself standing by the front window, looking out at the darkened street. The neighbors had retreated indoors, leaving the town in an eerie stillness. He could feel the unease in his chest growing, the sense that this was only the beginning of the challenges they would face. Melissa joined him, slipping her hand into his. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. "Honestly, I'm worried," Ethan admitted, his voice low. "I don't know what's waiting for us here, but whatever it is, we'll face it together." Melissa squeezed his hand. "We always do." Ethan nodded, drawing strength from her presence. "Let's get some rest. Tomorrow's a new day." As they turned off the lights and headed to bed, the Carters knew that this move was more than just a change of scenery. It was the start of a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty, but also with the hope that they could find a way to make this place their home. And as they drifted off to sleep, they held on to that hope, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Ethan Carter stood outside the Oak Ridge police station, taking a deep breath before entering. The building was old, its red brick walls faded with time, and the sign above the door barely legible. This was nothing like the modern, bustling precinct he had known in Miami. The small-town atmosphere was palpable, and Ethan could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, the smell of stale coffee and old wood hitting him immediately. The station was cramped and dimly lit, with outdated furniture that looked as if it had been there for decades. As Ethan made his way to the front desk, he noticed the stares. The officers in the room eyed him with a mixture of suspicion and thinly veiled hostility. "Can I help you?" The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with gray hair and tired eyes, asked, her tone more wary than welcoming. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Ethan Carter," he replied, keeping his voice calm and authoritative. "I'm here to take command of a special operation." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly, and she hesitated before responding. "Of course, sir. I'll let Captain Harris know you're here." As she picked up the phone, Ethan could feel the eyes of the other officers on him. Conversations had ceased, and the room was eerily quiet. He recognized the look, a mixture of curiosity and doubt, as if they were trying to size him up to decide if he was worthy of their respect. Within moments, Captain Harris appeared. He was a burly man in his 50s with a stern expression and a handshake that felt more like a test of strength than a greeting. "Johnson, right? Let's talk in my office." Ethan followed Harris down a narrow hallway, the walls lined with old photographs and commendations. The office was small and cluttered, the desk piled high with papers. Harris gestured for Ethan to take a seat before settling into his own chair. "I know you were sent here by higher-ups," Harris began, his tone gruff. "But let me be clear, we have our own way of doing things here in Oak Ridge. I expect you to understand that." Ethan met his gaze evenly. "I'm here to help in any way I can, Captain. My goal is to work with you and the team to make this operation successful." Harris smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. We'll see how that goes." He leaned back in his chair, the tension between them thickening the air. "I'm sure you'll find your place here, eventually." Ethan left the meeting feeling unsettled. It was clear that earning the trust of the Oak Ridge team was going to be a long, difficult process. But he was determined to prove himself, no matter how hostile the environment. Meanwhile, Melissa Carter stood outside Oak Ridge General Hospital, taking a moment to steady her nerves. The building was small, a far cry from the bustling Miami hospital where she had worked for years. The familiar sense of purpose she usually felt on her way to work was tinged with uncertainty now. She entered the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and old linoleum filling her senses. The corridors were narrow, and the lighting was harsh. Melissa approached the front desk, where a nurse was busy typing on a computer. "Hi, I'm Melissa Carter, the new nurse." The nurse looked up, her expression polite but distant. "All right, you're the transfer. Welcome to Oak Ridge General." Her tone was neutral, and the welcome felt more like an obligation than genuine hospitality. Melissa offered a small smile. "Thanks. I'm looking forward to working with everyone." The nurse nodded, already turning back to her screen. "You'll be with Dr. Thompson today. He's expecting you in the ER." Melissa made her way to the emergency room, trying to ignore the growing sense of isolation. As she entered the ER, she was greeted by a flurry of activity, doctors and nurses moving quickly, patients waiting in beds, the constant beep of monitors. It was familiar and yet different. The energy here was subdued, the staff's movements efficient, but lacking the camaraderie she had known in Miami. Dr. Thompson, a tall, thin man with a sharp, focused expression, approached her. "Melissa, welcome. We're a bit short-staffed today, so we'll need you to jump right in." "Of course," Melissa replied, slipping into the role she knew so well. But as the day wore on, she noticed the distance between her and the other staff members. They were professional, but there was a subtle undercurrent of wariness, as if they were unsure how to engage with her. During her lunch break, Melissa sat alone in the small, sterile break room, her thoughts racing. She had hoped to find some sense of connection here, but instead, she felt like an outsider. The friendly conversations she had been used to were replaced with curt nods and polite small talk. It was clear that it would take time to break through the barriers that had already been set up. By the end of her shift, Melissa was exhausted, not from the work itself, but from the effort of trying to navigate the unspoken tensions in the hospital. As she walked out of the building, she couldn't shake the feeling that the challenges in Oak Ridge were going to be far greater than she had anticipated. While Ethan and Melissa were navigating their first days at work, Ryan and Chloe Carter were facing their own challenges at Oak Ridge High School. The school building was old, with peeling paint and a worn-out facade. Inside, the hallways were narrow, the lockers dented and scratched from years of use. Ryan, a star basketball player back in Miami, had always found solace on the court. But as he walked through the halls of Oak Ridge High, he could feel the eyes on him. The stares weren't just curious. They were scrutinizing, as if the students were assessing whether he belonged. Chloe, ever observant, noticed the same thing, She kept her head down as they made their way to the administration office to pick up their schedules. The hallways were filled with groups of students who seemed to know each other well, their conversations pausing as the new faces passed by. At the office, a receptionist handed them their schedules with a tight-lipped smile. "Welcome to Oak Ridge High. I hope you settle in quickly." Ryan glanced at his schedule, already dreading the day. "This place is nothing like Miami," he muttered as they walked away. Chloe nodded, her expression somber. "I know. It feels different." Their first classes were uneventful, but the tension was palpable. The teachers were polite but distant, the students largely ignoring them except for the occasional whisper or glance. By lunchtime, Ryan and Chloe had barely spoken to anyone. In the cafeteria, they found an empty table and sat down, their trays of unappetizing food untouched. Ryan scanned the room, spotting a group of boys at a nearby table. They were laughing and joking, clearly close friends. Ryan recognized one of them, Brian, the captain of the basketball team. "I guess I'll have to prove myself all over again," Ryan said, trying to sound confident, but Chloe could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Give it time," Chloe replied, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. "We'll figure this out." But as the day dragged on, both siblings found it increasingly difficult to fit in. Chloe, who had always excelled in academics, felt out of place in her classes. The teachers didn't engage with her, and the students were content to leave her out of their conversations. Ryan, usually so confident, felt his resolve wavering as he faced the cold reception from his classmates. By the end of the day, Ryan and Chloe met up in the parking lot, both feeling deflated. "This place is going to be rough," Ryan said, kicking at the gravel. Chloe nodded, her shoulders slumped. "Yeah, but we'll get through it, right?" Ryan forced a smile. "Yeah, we got each other." As they headed home, both of them couldn't shake the feeling that their time in Oak Ridge was going to be far more challenging than they had imagined. Ethan's first week at the Oak Ridge police station was filled with tension. The officers were polite enough, but there was an undercurrent of resistance that was impossible to ignore. The team was tight-knit, and Ethan could sense that they viewed him as an outsider, a threat to their established way of doing things. One morning, as he was reviewing case files in his office, Ethan heard laughter coming from the break room next door. The sound was jarring in the otherwise quiet station. Curious and a bit uneasy, he decided to check it out. As he approached, the laughter grew louder, and he caught snippets of conversation, jokes that made his stomach turn. When he reached the doorway, he found Sergeant Peters at the center of it all, holding court with a group of officers. Peters, a veteran of the force with a grizzled face and a reputation for being tough, was telling a joke. The punchline involved a crude racial stereotype, and the room erupted in laughter as Peters finished. But when they saw Ethan standing there, the laughter died instantly. "Peters," Ethan said, keeping his voice steady despite the anger boiling inside him. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" Peters' expression hardened, but he nodded and followed Ethan into his office. Once the door was closed, Ethan turned to face him. "That kind of talk is not acceptable here, Sergeant. We need to maintain a professional and respectful environment." Peters folded his arms, leaning back against the door with a smirk. "It's just a joke, Johnson. Don't get your feathers ruffled." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "It's not just a joke. It's disrespectful, and it undermines the integrity of this department. I expect better from you." Peters' smirk faded, replaced by a look of defiance. "Look, Johnson, we've been doing things a certain way here for a long time. You might be in charge now, but that doesn't mean we're going to change just because you say so." Ethan held his ground. "I'm not asking for change, Sergeant. I'm demanding it. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated." For a moment, the two men stared each other down, the tension thick in the air. Finally, Peters pushed off the door and headed for the exit. "We'll see about that." As the door slammed behind him, Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He knew this was only the beginning. The battle for respect and professionalism in the Oak Ridge station was going to be a long, uphill fight. That evening, the Carters gathered around the dinner table, each carrying the weight of their first day in Oak Ridge. The meal was quiet, the usual lively conversation replaced by a somber silence. Ethan glanced around the table, noticing the tension in his family. So, how was everyone's first day? Melissa sighed, pushing her food around her plate. It was difficult. The hospital is different from what I'm used to. The staff was polite, but there's this distance. It feels like I'm not really welcome there. Ryan nodded, echoing her sentiment. Same at school. It's like we're invisible, but at the same time, everyone's watching us. It's weird. Chloe, who had been quiet, finally spoke up. I felt the same way. The teachers were nice enough, but the other kids, it's like they don't want to get to know us. Ethan's heart sank as he listened to his family's struggles. He had hoped the transition would be easier, but it was clear that they were all feeling the strain of being outsiders in a close-knit and possibly unwelcoming community. I'm sorry it's been tough, Ethan said, his voice heavy with concern. But we'll get through this. We've faced challenges before, and we've always come out stronger. Melissa reached across the table to squeeze his hand. We know, Ethan. We just need time to adjust. Ryan looked up, determination flickering in his eyes. We'll figure it out. We always do. Chloe nodded, though her expression remained worried. We just have to stick together. Ethan smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. Exactly. We're in this together, and we'll support each other no matter what. The family finished their meal in relative silence, the unspoken worries hanging in the air. As they cleared the table and prepared for the night, each of them knew that the challenges they faced in Oak Ridge were only just beginning. But they also knew that, as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came their way. Ethan looked around at his family, feeling a renewed sense of resolve. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he would do everything in his power to protect them and to ensure they found a way to thrive in this new, hostile environment. And with that thought, he went to bed, ready to face whatever challenges the next day would bring. Ethan Carter walked into the Oak Ridge police station early Monday morning, determined to set a positive tone for the week. He had spent the weekend thinking about how to bridge the gap between him and his new colleagues. It was clear that earning their respect would be a challenge, but he was prepared to lead by example. As he entered the briefing room, he noticed the usual group of officers gathered around, engaged in low conversation. Sergeant Peters, with his ever-present scowl, stood at the front, seemingly holding court. Ethan walked to the front of the room, commanding attention as he called the meeting to order. Good morning, everyone. Let's get started with today's updates. Ethan began, projecting confidence. He was determined to show that he was in control, despite the undercurrent of resistance. The officers settled into their seats, but Ethan could feel the tension in the room. He went through the usual updates on ongoing cases, assigning tasks and expecting professionalism in return. However, as he spoke, he noticed subtle signs of defiance. Officers whispering among themselves, exchanging looks, and occasionally glancing at Peters, as if taking cues from him. When Ethan finished his briefing and opened the floor for questions, Peters leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Lieutenant Colonel Carter, with all due respect, some of us have been handling these cases for years. We know what we're doing. Do you really think it's necessary to micromanage every step? Ethan met Peters' gaze, refusing to back down. My role here is to ensure that we're all working efficiently and effectively. That means I will be involved in the details, and I expect everyone to be on the same page. Peters smirked, and a few officers chuckled under their breath. Sûr, lieutenant. Whatever you say. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. This isn't about what I say, Peters. It's about what's best for this department and this community. I suggest we all focus on that. The meeting wrapped up with a palpable sense of unease. Ethan knew that he had not won any allies today, but he was resolute in his approach. He understood that earning their respect would be a marathon, not a sprint, and he was prepared for the long road ahead. At the same time, Melissa Carter was having her own struggles at Oak Ridge General Hospital. After her first week, she had hoped that things might improve, that her colleagues would warm up to her, and that she would start to feel like part of the team. But each day seemed to bring the same chilly reception. During her lunch break, Melissa decided to make another attempt to connect with her coworkers. She entered the break room, carrying her lunch tray, and noticed a group of nurses seated at a table, chatting quietly among themselves. Summoning her courage, Melissa approached them with a friendly smile. Mind if I join you? She asked, her voice warm. The nurses glanced at each other, their expressions unreadable. One of them, Sarah, who Melissa had spoken to briefly before, nodded slightly. "Sure, go ahead." Melissa sat down, trying to engage in the conversation. "So, how long have you all been working here?" Sarah shrugged. "A few years. It's a small town, so most of us have been here for a while." Another nurse, Jenny, added, "It's not often we get new staff around here. Most people who come don't stay long." The implication wasn't lost on Melissa. She felt a pang of isolation but pushed through it. "Well, I'm hoping to change that. I've always enjoyed working in hospitals, and I'm looking forward to getting to know everyone better." The nurses exchanged glances again, and the conversation drifted back to their usual topics: patients, hospital gossip, the mundane details of small-town life. Melissa tried to participate, but every attempt felt forced, like she was intruding on a conversation she wasn't truly welcome in. After a few more minutes of awkward small talk, Melissa excused herself, finishing her lunch alone at another table. The loneliness she felt was deepening, and she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever truly fit in at Oak Ridge General. The walls of the hospital, which had once represented a place of healing and camaraderie, now felt cold and unwelcoming. As she returned to work, Melissa resolved to keep trying, even if it felt hopeless. She couldn't afford to let this distance affect her performance or her outlook. But the growing sense of isolation weighed heavily on her, making each day a little harder than the last. While his parents were dealing with their own challenges, Ryan Carter was facing difficulties of his own at Oak Ridge High School. Back in Miami, basketball had been his sanctuary, a place where he could escape, excel, and feel like he belonged. But here in Oak Ridge, things were different. Ryan had joined the basketball team, hoping to find some common ground with his new classmates. But from the moment he stepped onto the court, he felt the same cold reception that his family had encountered elsewhere in the town. The other players barely acknowledged him, and Brian, the team captain, seemed particularly hostile. During practice, Ryan worked hard, determined to prove himself. He was fast, agile, and had a good shot, but no matter how well he performed, the other players kept their distance. Brian, in particular, seemed to resent him, going out of his way to exclude Ryan from team drills and plays. One afternoon, after practice had ended, Ryan approached Brian as they were leaving the gym. "Hey, Brian, can we talk for a minute?" Brian stopped, turning to face him with a guarded expression. "What's up?" Ryan hesitated, trying to find the right words. "I just wanted to say that I'm here to contribute to the team. I know I'm new, but I want to be part of this." Brian crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "Look, Carter, you might have been hot stuff back in Miami, but things are different here. We've got our way of doing things, and we don't need some outsider coming in and trying to take over." Ryan felt a surge of frustration. "I'm not trying to take over. I just want to be part of the team." Brian's eyes narrowed. "Well, maybe you should stop trying so hard. We'll decide if you're part of the team or not." With that, Brian turned and walked away, leaving Ryan standing alone in the empty gym. The weight of the words hung in the air, and Ryan felt a deep sense of rejection. He had never had to fight so hard just to be accepted. As he walked home, Ryan replayed the conversation in his mind, his resolve hardening. He knew he was facing an uphill battle, but he wasn't going to back down. He had worked too hard to get where he was, and he wasn't about to let some small-town prejudice take that away from him. Chloe Carter was having her own struggles at Oak Ridge High, though they were of a different nature. An excellent student, Chloe had always excelled in her classes, and she had hoped that academics might provide her with a refuge from the hostility she felt at school. But even in the classroom, she found herself facing subtle but persistent prejudice. During a history class, the teacher, Mr. Davis, was leading a discussion on civil rights. The topic was one that Chloe was passionate about, and she had hoped it might open up an opportunity for meaningful dialogue. However, as the discussion progressed, she noticed that every time she raised her hand, Mr. Davis seemed to deliberately overlook her. Frustrated but determined, Chloe finally spoke up without being called on. "Mr. Davis, I think it's important to consider how these historical issues still affect us today, especially in places like Oak Ridge." The room fell silent, and Mr. Davis looked at her with a blank expression. "That's an interesting point, Chloe. But let's stick to the textbook for now." Chloe felt a flush of anger and embarrassment. She knew she was being dismissed, not because her point wasn't valid, but because it was uncomfortable. The other students exchanged glances, some smirking, while others looked away, clearly not wanting to engage. After class, as she was packing up her books, a group of girls approached her. One of them, Heather, who had been one of the more vocal participants in the discussion, smiled at Chloe, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Chloe, you sure have a lot to say about civil rights," Heather said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But maybe you should stick to the topics we're actually supposed to be discussing." Chloe met her gaze, refusing to back down. "I think it's important to talk about how these issues affect us today. It's not just history, it's our reality." Heather's smile faded, and she leaned in closer. "Well, maybe you should learn a bit more about Oak Ridge before you start telling us how things should be." The words were a clear warning, and Chloe felt the sting of exclusion. As the girls walked away, Chloe realized that she was facing more than just academic challenges. She was up against a deeply ingrained culture of silence and resistance to change. As she walked to her next class, Chloe felt the weight of isolation pressing down on her. She had always been confident in her ability to succeed academically, but here, even that felt like it was being taken away from her. But like her brother, she wasn't about to give up. If anything, the resistance only made her more determined to stand up for what she believed in. After a long and challenging week, Ethan Carter decided to go for a late-night jog to clear his mind. Running had always been his way of dealing with stress, a chance to let go of the day's frustrations and focus on the rhythm of his breath and the pounding of his feet on the pavement. The streets of Oak Ridge were quiet at night, the only sounds coming from the occasional barking dog or the rustling of leaves in the breeze. As he ran, Ethan thought about the week's events, the resistance from his colleagues, the struggles his family was facing, and the nagging feeling that they were all being watched, judged by the town's residents. As he turned down a side street, he noticed a police car slowly cruising past. He gave the officers a friendly wave, but the car stopped, and the two officers inside quickly got out. "Hey, you there!" one of the officers called out, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" Ethan stopped, pulling out his earbuds. "Just going for a jog, officer. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Ethan Carter, recently transferred to Oak Ridge." The older officer, a burly man with a hard expression, took a step closer. "Lieutenant Colonel? Ooh, and you expect us to believe that? What's a man like you doing in this neighborhood?" Ethan felt his stomach drop. He knew exactly what the officer meant by a man like you. He kept his voice steady. "I live just down the street. I'm part of the Oak Ridge police force now." The younger officer, who had been silent until now, looked skeptical. "Got any ID on you?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I left it at home. Like I said, I was just out for a run." The older officer's expression hardened. "Get down on the ground, hands on your head. Now!" Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "Officers, there's no need for this. I'm one of you. Down. On. The ground," the older officer repeated, his hand on his gun. Realizing he had no choice, Ethan slowly knelt down and lay on the ground, his hands on his head. The officers moved in quickly, one of them pulling out handcuffs as they roughly turned him over. "This is a misunderstanding," Ethan tried to explain as they cuffed him. "You can call the station and confirm who I am." "Yeah, we'll see about that," the older officer muttered, giving him a light kick in the side as they hauled him to his feet and shoved him into the back of the police car. As they drove him to the station, Ethan felt a deep sense of humiliation and anger. He knew that this was more than just a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate show of power, a message that he was not welcome in Oak Ridge, not even among the police force he was supposed to be leading. By the time they arrived at the station and his identity was confirmed, the damage had already been done. The officers mumbled an insincere apology as they uncuffed him and let him go, but Ethan knew that this was only the beginning. The incident had shaken him deeply, and he realized that the fight he was facing in Oak Ridge was far more personal and dangerous than he had initially thought. As he walked home, the cool night air did little to calm his racing thoughts. He knew that he had to take action, not just for himself, but for his family and for everyone in Oak Ridge who had been mistreated by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The battle for justice was just beginning, and Ethan was more determined than ever to see it through, no matter the cost. Ethan Carter arrived home after his late-night ordeal, his mind still reeling from the events. The humiliation of being treated like a criminal by his own colleagues gnawed at him, leaving him with a deep sense of anger and frustration. He quietly closed the door behind him, but the sound was enough to wake Melissa, who had been anxiously waiting for him to return. "Ethan?" Melissa's voice was filled with concern as she hurried into the hallway. "What happened? You've been gone for so long, and you didn't answer your phone." Ethan sighed, running a hand over his face. "I had an encounter with 2 officers while I was out jogging. They didn't recognize me, and let's just say things escalated." Melissa's eyes widened in shock. "Escalated? What do you mean?" "They handcuffed me, Melissa. They thought I was some criminal prowling around the neighborhood." Ethan's voice was bitter, the sting of the memory still fresh. "Even after I told them who I was, they didn't believe me. It wasn't until they brought me to the station that they realized their mistake." Melissa's face drained of color, and she reached out to steady herself against the wall. "Oh my God, Ethan, are you okay? Did they hurt you?" "No, I'm fine physically," Ethan replied, though the emotional toll was evident in his tone. "But this was about more than just a misunderstanding. It was about who I am and what I represent to them." Melissa's eyes filled with tears as she pulled him into a tight embrace. "This is unacceptable. We can't just let this go, Ethan. They need to be held accountable." Ethan nodded, the resolve in his chest hardening. "I know. I'm going to file a formal complaint. They can't be allowed to treat anyone like this, especially not someone who's supposed to be leading them." As they stood there in the dimly lit hallway, their children, Ryan and Chloe, appeared, having overheard the conversation. Ryan's fists were clenched at his sides, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Dad, is it true? They really did that to you?" Chloe looked equally shaken, her eyes wide with fear. "How could they? You're their leader, their boss." Ethan turned to his children, trying to offer them some reassurance. "It's true, but I'm going to make sure it's dealt with. This is why we're here, to stand up to this kind of behavior and make things right." The family gathered in the living room, where Ethan recounted the details of the incident. As he spoke, the anger in the room grew palpable, each family member grappling with the realization that the fight they were facing was more dangerous and personal than they had imagined. By the time he finished, Melissa's fear had transformed into determination. "You're right, Ethan. We can't let them get away with this. We'll fight back, together." Ryan and Chloe nodded in agreement, their resolve mirroring that of their parents. The Carters knew that they were in for a long, difficult battle, but they were united in their commitment to see it through. The next morning, Ethan was back at the Oak Ridge police station, but this time with a different purpose. He walked through the doors with a steely determination, his mind focused on the task ahead. The station was quiet, the usual buzz of activity muted as he made his way to Captain Harris's office. Ethan knocked once before entering, finding Captain Harris seated at his desk, looking up in surprise at the unannounced visit. "Lieutenant Colonel Carter, what can I do for you?" "I need to file a formal complaint, Captain," Ethan said, his voice firm. "It's regarding the incident last night involving 2 of our officers." Harris's expression shifted to one of concern, and he gestured for Ethan to take a seat. "Tell me what happened." Ethan recounted the events of the previous night in detail, sparing nothing as he described the officers' actions and the humiliation he had endured. As he spoke, Harris's face grew increasingly serious, the weight of the situation sinking in. "This is deeply troubling, Carter," Harris said after a long pause. "I'll initiate an internal investigation immediately. Rest assured, we take this kind of behavior very seriously." Ethan studied Harris's reaction, sensing a hint of reluctance beneath the surface. "I appreciate that, Captain, but I need to know that this will be handled thoroughly. The officers involved need to be held accountable, not just for me, but for the message it sends to the entire department." Harris nodded, though there was a subtle tension in his posture. "You have my word, Carter. We'll get to the bottom of this." As Ethan left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that Harris was holding something back. He had promised an investigation, but Ethan knew from experience that promises in situations like these could be hollow. He would have to keep a close eye on the process, ensuring that it wasn't just a perfunctory gesture meant to placate him. Ethan returned to his duties, but the incident weighed heavily on his mind. The fight for justice had begun, but it was clear that it would be an uphill battle, fraught with resistance from within the very institution he was trying to change. The tension from the previous night's events didn't just stay within the walls of the Carter home. As word of the incident spread throughout Oak Ridge, it began to affect Ryan and Chloe at school. The atmosphere at Oak Ridge High, already cold and unwelcoming, grew even more hostile. Ryan noticed the change almost immediately. Whispers followed him down the hallways, and the stares from his classmates were more pointed than before. It wasn't long before he encountered Brian, the basketball team captain, who seemed to take a perverse pleasure in the situation. "So, I hear your dad had a little run-in with the law," Brian said with a smirk as they passed each other in the hallway. "Guess he's not as high and mighty as he thinks he is, huh?" Ryan stopped, his fists clenching at his sides. "My dad was just doing what's right, Brian. Those cops had no reason to treat him the way they did." Brian shrugged, his smirk never faltering. "Maybe, but that's how things work around here. You should get used to it." The words stung, but Ryan forced himself to stay calm. "I don't plan on getting used to it, and neither does my dad." Brian's smirk faded slightly, and he gave Ryan a long, hard look before walking away. Ryan knew that standing up to Brian wouldn't win him any friends, but he didn't care. He wasn't going to let anyone bully him into silence. Meanwhile, Chloe faced her own challenges in the classroom. The incident had only intensified the isolation she felt from her peers. During a class discussion, one of the students, a girl named Heather, made a snide comment about people not knowing their place, which was clearly directed at Chloe. Chloe felt the anger rise in her chest, but she kept her voice steady as she responded. Maybe people wouldn't have to fight so hard if they were treated with the respect they deserve. The classroom fell silent, and all eyes turned to Chloe. Heather rolled her eyes, but she didn't have a retort. The teacher, Mr. Davis, quickly moved the discussion forward, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the room. After class, Chloe found herself alone in the hallway, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had always been confident in her abilities, but here, in Oak Ridge, it felt like no matter what she did, she would always be seen as an outsider. Ryan found her by her locker, and they exchanged a look of shared frustration. "This place just keeps getting worse," Ryan muttered, leaning against the lockers. Chloe nodded, her expression somber. "I know, but we can't let them win. We have to stick together, no matter what." Ryan placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Yeah, we do. We're stronger together." As they walked to their next class, side by side, they knew that the fight wasn't just their father's, it was theirs too. And they were determined to see it through, no matter how tough it got. Back at the station, Ethan continued to sense the growing tension among his colleagues. The investigation into the incident had begun, but Ethan noticed that the atmosphere had become even more strained. Officers who had once been openly hostile now avoided eye contact, while others seemed to be watching him more closely. One afternoon, as Ethan was reviewing reports in his office, there was a knock on the door. He looked up to see Sergeant Peters standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Johnson, can we talk?" Peters asked, his tone unusually subdued. Ethan nodded, gesturing for him to enter. "Sure, Peters. What's on your mind?" Peters closed the door behind him and hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I heard about what happened the other night. I want you to know, I don't agree with everything that's going on around here." Ethan studied Peters carefully, trying to gauge his sincerity. "I appreciate you saying that, Peters. But words aren't enough. We need to see action." Peters shifted uncomfortably. "I know. I've been around long enough to see how things work in this town. Change doesn't come easy, especially not here. But I've got to admit, no one deserves what you went through." Ethan leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Then help me make that change, Peters. This isn't just about me. It's about the entire department, the entire town. We need to set a new standard, and that starts with holding people accountable." Peters looked down at his feet, his reluctance clear. I'm not saying I'm ready to go up against the whole department, Johnson, but I'll do what I can to make sure things don't get worse. It wasn't the full support Ethan had hoped for, but it was a start. He nodded, accepting Peters's tentative offer. That's all I ask, Peters. Do what you can, and we'll take it from there. As Peters left the office, Ethan couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something, an acknowledgement that the fight for change wasn't entirely hopeless. But he also knew that he couldn't rely on half-hearted support. The battle ahead would require much more than that. That evening, the Carters gathered around the dinner table once more. The mood was subdued, each family member processing the events of the day in their own way. Ethan could see the strain on his wife and children, the toll that the hostility of Oak Ridge was taking on them. But despite the challenges, there was a sense of unity in the air, a determination to stand together, no matter what. "How was school today?" Melissa asked, her voice gentle as she looked at Ryan and Chloe. Ryan shrugged. "It wasn't great. People are talking, and not in a good way. But Chloe and I, we're sticking together." Chloe nodded in agreement, though her expression was weary. "We have to. It's the only way we'll get through this." Ethan felt a surge of pride in his children. They were facing adversity head-on, refusing to back down in the face of prejudice and exclusion. "I'm proud of you both," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You're showing incredible strength." Melissa reached across the table, taking Ethan's hand. "And so are you, Ethan. What you're doing, it's not just for us. It's for everyone in this town who's been treated unfairly. We're with you every step of the way." Ethan squeezed her hand, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you, Melissa. I couldn't do this without you all. This fight isn't going to be easy, but as long as we have each other, I know we'll make it through." The family shared a quiet but meaningful meal, their bond strengthened by the challenges they were facing. They knew the road ahead would be tough, but they were ready to face it together, united in their commitment to justice and to each other. As the evening drew to a close, Ethan felt a deep sense of resolve. The fight for justice had only just begun, but he was more determined than ever to see it through, no matter the cost. With his family by his side, he knew that they could overcome any obstacle that came their way. The internal investigation into the officers involved in Ethan's unjust detention had officially begun, and the tension within the Oak Ridge police station was palpable. Ethan could feel the weight of it every time he walked through the station doors. Conversations hushed as he approached, and the once cold stares from his colleagues had now turned into something more menacing. Ethan spent most of his days buried in paperwork, reviewing case files and gathering information. He knew that if the investigation was to be thorough, he had to stay vigilant and ensure that nothing was swept under the rug. However, the deeper he delved into the records, the more he realized that this was no simple case of misconduct. There was something far more insidious at play. One afternoon, as he was reviewing old files, Ethan noticed a pattern that sent chills down his spine. Several incidents involving racial profiling and excessive use of force had been quietly closed with little to no disciplinary action. The names of the officers involved in these incidents were disturbingly familiar. They were the same ones who had detained him. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. This was more than just a few bad apples. The corruption ran deep, and it was clear that there had been a concerted effort to cover up the truth. He knew that exposing this would be dangerous, but it was something he couldn't ignore. As he continued to piece together the evidence, Ethan could sense the growing hostility from his colleagues. Officers who had once merely ignored him were now actively avoiding him, their glares filled with contempt. It was clear that they knew he was getting closer to the truth, and they didn't like it. One evening, as he was leaving the station, Ethan was approached by Officer Daniels, a younger officer who had always been respectful toward him. Daniels looked around nervously before speaking. "Lieutenant Colonel, can I have a word?" Ethan nodded, sensing the urgency in the young man's voice. "Of course, Daniels. What's on your mind?" Daniels glanced around again, as if making sure they weren't being watched. "Sir, I've heard some things about the investigation. You need to be careful. There are people here who don't want the truth to come out, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to keep it buried." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, but he kept his voice steady. Thanks for the warning, Daniels. I appreciate it. Daniels nodded, his expression serious. Just watch your back, sir. This town, it's not what it seems. As Daniels walked away, Ethan knew that the danger was real. The investigation was heating up, and the closer he got to the truth, the more risks he would face. But he also knew that backing down wasn't an option. The corruption needed to be exposed, no matter the cost. Back at home, Melissa Carter was growing increasingly worried about Ethan. She could see the strain the investigation was putting on him, and the subtle changes in his demeanor didn't go unnoticed. He was more tense, more guarded, and there was a look in his eyes that told her he was carrying a burden far heavier than he was letting on. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Melissa sat down with Ethan in the living room. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "Ethan, I'm worried about you." Ethan looked at her, his eyes reflecting the weight of everything he had uncovered. "I know, Melissa, but I have to do this. The things I found, they go deeper than I ever imagined. If we don't expose this, it's going to keep happening, and more people will suffer." Melissa squeezed his hand, her heart aching for him. "I understand, Ethan, but you're putting yourself in danger. And not just you, the kids and I are part of this too. What if they come after us?" Ethan's expression softened, and he pulled her closer. "I won't let that happen. I promise. But I need you to trust me. We can't let fear stop us from doing what's right." Melissa nodded, though the fear still gnawed at her. "I trust you, Ethan, but maybe we should consider going public with this. If the media gets involved, it might be harder for them to cover it up." Ethan thought about it for a moment. It was a risky move, but Melissa had a point. If the investigation was buried, going public might be their only option. "You might be right. Let's see how the investigation plays out. If it looks like they're trying to sweep it under the rug, we'll take it to the media." Melissa felt a small sense of relief, but the worry still lingered. She knew that the road ahead was dangerous, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their family was being pulled into something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. But she also knew that Ethan was right. They couldn't back down now. As the days passed, Ethan's investigation continued to uncover more disturbing evidence. He had been focusing on the old case files, but something had been bothering him about the way certain reports were filed. There was a pattern, one that seemed almost too calculated to be a coincidence. One night, after everyone else had left the station, Ethan stayed behind to go through some of the older files. As he sifted through the paperwork, he came across a file that had been tucked away in the back of a drawer. The name on the file caught his attention: Officer Jameson, his predecessor. Ethan opened the file, his heart pounding. Inside, he found reports that were strikingly similar to the ones he had been investigating. Jameson had been looking into the same cases, the same officers, and he had been gathering evidence of corruption, just as Ethan was now. But the file abruptly ended, with no indication of what had happened next. It was as if Jameson had simply stopped his investigation, except Ethan knew that wasn't the case. Jameson had been forced out, his reputation tarnished by false accusations. And now Ethan realized that the same thing was happening to him. Ethan sat back, the weight of the realization pressing down on him. The same people who had driven Jameson out were now trying to do the same to him. They were setting him up, laying the groundwork to discredit him. And if he wasn't careful, he would be the next victim of their conspiracy. But Ethan wasn't about to let that happen. He had seen the signs, and now he knew what he was up against. He would have to be smarter, more cautious, and more determined than ever if he was going to expose the truth and protect his family. He gathered the files, carefully placing them back in the drawer. He knew that the evidence he had uncovered was dangerous, but it was also the key to taking down the corrupt officers who had been operating with impunity for far too long. As he left the station that night, Ethan's resolve was stronger than ever. He knew that the fight ahead would be brutal, but he was ready. The truth was too important to be silenced, and he was determined to see justice served. While Ethan was uncovering the dark secrets within the police department, Ryan and Chloe were facing their own battles at school. The tension at Oak Ridge High had reached a boiling point, and both siblings were fed up with the constant hostility and prejudice. Ryan, who had always been passionate about basketball, decided that he wasn't going to let the team's toxic atmosphere continue unchecked. During a school assembly, he took the opportunity to address the entire student body. As he stood at the podium, he could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, some filled with curiosity, others with disdain. But Ryan didn't let that deter him. "I'm not from Oak Ridge, but that doesn't mean I don't belong here," he began, his voice steady. "We all deserve respect, no matter where we come from or what we look like. And it's time we start treating each other that way." There were murmurs throughout the auditorium, but Ryan pressed on. "I've heard the comments, seen the looks, and I know that some of you don't think I should be here. But that's not going to stop me from being part of this school, this community. We're better than this. We can be better than this." The room was silent as Ryan finished his speech. He knew that not everyone would be swayed, but he had spoken his truth, and that was enough. As he stepped down from the podium, a few students clapped, and Ryan noticed that some of his teammates were among them. It was a small victory, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Chloe was facing a different kind of challenge. In her history class, the discussion had once again turned to civil rights, and this time, Chloe decided that she wasn't going to stay silent. When one of her classmates made a dismissive comment about the importance of learning about the past, Chloe spoke up. "The past isn't just history, it's the foundation of our present. If we ignore it, we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes." The class fell silent, and the teacher, Mr. Davis, looked uncomfortable. "That's a valid point, Chloe, but let's try to focus on the lesson at hand." But Chloe wasn't finished. The lesson isn't just about dates and events. It's about understanding the impact of those events on people's lives today. We can't pretend that what happened 50 years ago doesn't still affect us now. There were a few murmurs of agreement, and Chloe could see that some of her classmates were paying attention in a way they hadn't before. She knew that speaking out wouldn't change everything overnight, but it was a step in the right direction. As she left class that day, Chloe felt a sense of pride. She had stood up for what she believed in, just like her father was doing. And no matter how difficult things got, she knew she couldn't back down. That evening, the Carter family gathered in the living room, each of them carrying the weight of the day's events. Ethan could see the determination in his children's eyes, and he knew that they had been fighting their own battles at school. As they sat together, Ethan shared the disturbing discovery he had made about Jameson and the similarities between their situations. Melissa listened intently, her worry evident but tempered by the resolve she had shown the night before. "I don't think we can wait any longer," Ethan said finally. "If the investigation gets buried, we're going to have to go public with what we know. It's the only way to make sure the truth comes out." Melissa nodded, her expression serious. "I agree, but we need to be prepared for what that could mean for us, for the kids. Once we take this public, there's no going back." Ryan and Chloe exchanged a look, and then Ryan spoke up. "We're ready, Dad. We've been dealing with this at school, too, and we're not going to let them push us around anymore. If going public is what it takes, then let's do it." Chloe nodded in agreement. "We're in this together. Whatever happens, we'll face it as a family." Ethan felt a surge of pride in his family. They were standing strong, united in the face of adversity, and he knew that together they could overcome anything. "All right," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We'll give the investigation a little more time, but if it looks like they're trying to cover it up, we'll go to the media. And when we do, we'll make sure the whole truth comes out." The family spent the rest of the evening discussing their plan, knowing that the road ahead would be difficult and filled with risks. But they were ready to face it, knowing that their fight for justice was more important than anything else. As they finally went to bed that night, there was a sense of peace in the house, despite the uncertainty of what was to come. The Carters had made their decision, and they would face whatever challenges came their way, together.